my name is Maggie Glick, and welcome to my senior TED Talk. Imagine you're building a house, not just any house, but your dream house. You got the blueprint, the foundation is poured, and the walls are going up. But halfway through construction, someone shows up every day and quietly removes a few screws. Not enough to collapse the house immediately, just enough, years later, doors don't close right, pipes leak, and things start to fall apart. Now I want you to imagine that that house is your brain, and the person removing the screws is high-potency cannabis use during adolescence. Now, before you tune me out, this is not going to be a just say no speech, because honestly, that's not realistic, and it's not effective either. This is about understanding what's happening in your brain, so you can decide what to do with it yourself. My research question is, consistent high-potency cannabis use during adolescence affects the developing brain by disturbing calcium-dependent dopamine release and slowing brain tissue iron accumulation. I'm going to show you a video that shows that THC doesn't just affect the brain in the moment, but it can change how the brain responds over time.
Why it responds. It changes the way your brain filters reality. THC interacts with the systems that regulate mood, memory, and perception, which is why time feels slower and ordinary moments feel more intense. Sounds seem richer, laughter comes easier, and your mind drifts into places it normally would not go. For many people, it feels like mental space, like the pressure inside their head has finally eased, but the brain learns from repetition. When that relief keeps coming from weed, your natural stress response begins to weaken. Motivation feels lower, focus becomes harder to hold, and emotions start to flatten when you are sober. What once felt like freedom slowly becomes something you depend on to feel balanced.
Okay. So as you saw from that video, the brain adapts. It can slowly start to rely on THC to feel normal, which is how dependence develops. When you connect that back to an underdeveloped brain, these changes can have huge impacts. Here's something that most people don't realize, but your brain doesn't fully develop until around the age of 25, which is slightly inconvenient considering we let 16-year-olds drive and 18-year-olds make huge life decisions, such as being able to vote, opening a credit card, even having a will. At the same time, cannabis is one of the most commonly used psychoactive substances in the United States, with millions of people using it each year, making this especially relevant. Daily cannabis use has increased by 50% from 1992. According to studies, cannabis today is not the same as it used to be. In the 1970s, cannabis was around 2 to 4%, and that's for bud and flower. Now today, in 2026, we see cannabis potencies being as much to 20 to 30%. And with modern day technology, we can see some concentrates reaching up to 90% THC, which is insane. So we're not just talking about use, we're talking about high potency cannabis exposure during the critical stage of brain development. So what's actually happening inside your brain? To understand that, we need to zoom down to the level of a single neuron. Research shows that adolescence is a developmental peak period for dopamine, during which the dopamine system is still maturing, making the brain especially vulnerable to disruptions during this critical stage of development. At the center of all of this is dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that plays a major role in motivation, reward, and learning. Dopamine is often referred to as the feel-good drug, but dopamine is really about prediction and motivation. It helps your brain decide what's worth your time, energy, and attention. For example, if you're studying for a test really hard and you get a good grade, your brain releases dopamine. That signal tells your brain it was worth it, let's do it again. Or even if you're scrolling on your phone and you get a notification. That small burst of dopamine reinforces the behavior, making you want to keep checking your phone. Even things like eating your favorite foods, achieving goals, and getting a compliment can trigger dopamine release. Over time, your brain uses these signals to build patterns, basically learning what's rewarding and what's not. And that's why it's so important that these systems work correctly, especially during adolescence when these patterns are still being formed. Dopamine is first made from the amino acid tyrosine, which then gets converted into L-dopa and then into dopamine. That dopamine is then packaged into tiny vesicles by a transporter called VMAT2, basically loading it into microscopic delivery trucks. Now here's where it gets really precise. When a neuron fires an electrical signal, called an action potential, that action potential then travels down the axon to the terminal. This opens voltage-gated calcium channels, allowing calcium ions to rush to the cell. Calcium then binds to proteins, which acts as a sensor, triggering vesicles to fuse with the membrane through a complex system. That fusion is actually what releases the dopamine. So this whole system depends on timing, precision, and calcium availability. No calcium, no dopamine release. Now here's where THC comes in. Research shows us that THC binds to CB1 receptors on the presynaptic neuron. These receptors act like a brake system. When activated, they inhibit those voltage-gated calcium channels, meaning less calcium enters the neuron. Less calcium means fewer vesicle fusion. Fewer vesicle fusion means less dopamine is released. So instead of clean, well-timed dopamine signaling, you get something more inconsistent. And during adolescence, when this system is still being built, that inconsistency matters. So I want you to think about, yes, your calcium channels are being changed right now, but they'll also be changed long-term. That THC can actually alter the calcium channels to suppress dopamine even when THC isn't even in the system. Now here's another piece of information that's just as important, but way less talked about, and that's brain tissue iron accumulation. Now, when most people hear iron, they think about your diet. But in the brain, iron plays a really important role in brain development. It helps your brain produce dopamine, but it also supports how efficiently brain cells communicate with one another. So, as your brain naturally develops, these iron levels should naturally increase in areas, especially in areas involved in motivation and reward. But little fact, but scientists can actually use scans to track iron levels. They use special scans called fMRI machines. Researchers can track changes in brain tissue iron over time because iron slightly changes how brain tissue appears on scans. So this gives us a way to watch development happen in real time. One study I read followed teenagers between the ages of 11 and 18 over several years, scanning their brains multiple times. And here's what they found. On the left, you can see how the study works. It's measuring brain tissue iron levels in a part of the brain called the basal ganglia, which is heavily involved in motivation and reward. Normally, as a teenager gets older, these iron levels should increase, which shows healthy brain development. In the middle graph, you can see we're comparing teens who used substances versus those who didn't. The research showed that those who used substances had a slower increase of brain tissue over time, so their brains weren't developing at the same pace as someone who didn't use substances. Then, if we look to the right, this starts to look at the behavior. Some of those teens were given tasks involved with motivation and reward, basically testing how their brains respond when there's something to look forward to. Teens with lower iron levels, meaning teens who did use substances, showed weaker responses in those tasks compared to those who didn't smoke. So when you connect everything together, iron supports dopamine, dopamine supports motivation, and if iron isn't increasing the way it should be during adolescence, that system may not develop as efficiently. So it isn't just a small biological change. This research suggests that substance use during adolescence could actually slow down how the brain builds its motivation and reward systems. Think about how easy it is to get stuck in patterns, like telling yourself you'll do your homework but you end up staring at your phone for an hour, or even losing motivation for things that used to hold value. That's not just about willpower, that's your brain's reward system being shaped over time and forming new patterns due to THC. Now, to be clear, not every adolescent who use cannabis will experience some effects. Genetics, environment, and frequency all play a role. But what this research does show us is that adolescence is a sensitive window, and repetitive, consistent cannabis use which is commonly defined as 20 times within a 30-day window, or when it starts to become part of your daily life using terms such as wake and bake, etc. That exposure during this time can have measurable impacts on how the brain develops. Cannabis today is more accessible than ever before. It's socially normalized, widely available, and often seen as low risk. Many adolescents struggle with substance use, yet society rarely takes responsibility for the role it has in creating that problem. We see adults with fully developed brains that are designing and marketing highly potent products that are clearly appealing to teenagers, products that are flavored, discreet, and easy to use. At the same time, the adolescent's brain, especially the prefrontal cortex, which is in charge of impulse control, is still developing. So we have a situation where the ones that are most biologically vulnerable are also the ones being most heavily exposed. And when this happens, the addiction falls on individuals who can't seek help without feeling blamed or judged. So it raises an important question. How much responsibility falls on adolescents, and how much falls on the system creating these products? This research matters because the teenage brain is still developing. If cannabis interferes with calcium signaling, slowing brain tissue iron accumulation and dopamine release during this time, it can also affect motivation, decision-making, and how the brain responds to rewards. Once again, there are also outside factors such as diet, hormone, and overall brain health that may influence brain development. There is still more research to be done, but we do know enough to be asking better questions. So when we talk about cannabis in teenagers, the question isn't, is it bad? Because this isn't about fear or judgment, it's about awareness. If calcium's the spark, dopamine's the signal, and iron's the fuel, then THC use is changing this entire system. And the choices made during this time don't just affect the present, they can shape how motivation, decision, and rewards work for years to come. Remember the house from the beginning, the ones where screws were being removed every day. The scary part about that house is you might not realize that the screws are being removed until it's too late. Years later, when things don't work the way they should, that's when it shows up. But the good news is you're still building your house, and you still have control over how strong that structure can become. So, to conclude, you deserve to understand what's happening inside your own brain, because once you understand it, you get the power to decide what to do with that knowledge. My name is Maggie Glick again, and thank you so much for coming to my senior TED Talk.